While playing games like No Man's Sky, Elite Dangerous, or Star Citizen, have you ever wondered what it would be like to have to manage a space station that exists in one of these games' universes? There must be a bunch of interesting decisions that need to be made. After all, if you mess up something like resource acquisition, well, you may not have enough oxygen, and not enough oxygen on a space station equals, everyone struggling to breathe. Furthermore, it's not cheap to set up something like a space station. This means there'd probably be something like a large corporate backer that you'd have to keep happy. Balancing the wants of the corporation that owns the station, the crew that run the station, and, well, the customers, that's bound to be quite interesting and maybe facilitate quite a lot of gameplay for, well, a standalone game. And that's my goal, to create a management game about creating and expanding your own space station. One thing I always like about management games and also city builders is when they have a campaign that slowly builds up in complexity and introduces you to all the mechanics, and, well, often presents an interesting enough narrative to go along with it. Whilst I won't give any examples of RTS games because, well, I'm not trying to make an RTS game, I will give 2 examples from the city builder genre that I really liked. Those are Pharaoh and Stronghold. As a kid, I remember playing both of those games a lot, and yeah, I loved the slowly unfolding campaigns and narratives of both. Other things from Pharaoh that I really like are how building placement affects the nature of the city. It handles it through a beautification system where in order to upgrade your houses, you need to make the area, well, attractive to a certain degree. There'll be things that will boost that, large opulent temples, palaces, things like that, and storage yards and industry that will provide negative modifiers. Stronghold, on the other hand, always had a bit more of a focus on the military aspects of a sort of city builder, medieval castle game. A large chunk of it was dedicated to siege mechanics, and that's not necessarily something that I want in my space game, but that doesn't mean I can't take some inspiration. What I'm going to do is I'm going to treat it a bit more like a tower defense, but, well, the thing you're defending is not just some arbitrary points that the enemies have to get to, but the station itself. As a result, this means that the players are going to have to create static defenses that will defend the station. One of the main ways by which you lose in Stronghold is if your lord gets killed, and likewise in my game, instead of a lord, there'll be a central command hub that you've got to defend. If that gets destroyed, it's game over. This won't be the only way of losing, of course. You'll also be able to go bankrupt because, well, at the end of the day, you're being charged with making money, and if you fail to do that, you're going to get sacked. Even if you don't go bankrupt, if the corporation is displeased with you to such a degree that they want to remove you, well, that's also game over. As alluded to earlier, the final way of losing the game is if some of the necessary resources to run your station run out. These will be the energy required to power your systems, oxygen for the station, and food. So what are the core pillars of the game? As far as I see, there are 3 of them. The faction reputation system, the dynamic event system, and the component placement system. When I talk about a component placement system, I'm not just talking about a system to simply attach components together. That's already in the game, it's already there, it's already built. What I'm talking about really is how you place components together and what benefits they give for being close to each other. So adjacency bonuses, things like that. The whole point of the system is to encourage players to place related and similar components together in order to gain a bonus. This should mean that things should hopefully be less of a sprawling mess and more like tightly designed, almost mini districts within the space station. The next pillar is the dynamic event system, and really the whole reason for this thing existing is, well, to make the game more than just a build order, a series of things you have to do and tick boxes to complete. The dynamic event system will basically be in charge of throwing wrenches into gears and messing everything up, forcing the player to react to things they'd never planned for. This could include, world events such as asteroid impacts or sabotage by the crew if they're displeased. And that nicely brings us on to the final of the pillars, the faction reputation system. The main job of the faction reputation system is almost to give the game memory of how you dealt with events, and then react accordingly. There are going to be some events where the outcomes might annoy a particular faction, and that means that faction is more likely to give you negative events. And likewise, if a faction is quite pleased with you, they're more likely to give you positive events. Examples of this could be if the crew of the station were particularly displeased, they may work at a less effective rate, and things that give resource outputs may have their output halved. Likewise, if they're quite happy with the way you're running things, maybe they're willing to work overtime, and as a result, you get a higher output on particular components. As I previously mentioned, the faction reputation system will also be a lose condition. If the corporate satisfaction rate goes to 0, they'll sack you. The plan is to always have a minimum of 3 factions operating within or around the station. Those 3 factions are the corporation, the crew that work on the station, and the guests that visit the station. I've already explained a little bit of the ideas behind, the corporation and the crew satisfaction ratings, but I haven't really touched on the guests yet. The guest satisfaction rating will work a bit more like games like Zoo Tycoon, I guess, where the more satisfied people are, the more likely people are to turn up at the station. Certain components, such as the commercial hub, will require guests in order to make money. After all, you can't sell stuff to people if no one's visiting the station. So it's important that you keep the satisfaction high in order to ensure there are enough guests to properly populate these components and make you money. If you don't keep them happy, you could find yourself in a really bad feedback loop where people get more and more annoyed because you're losing money and you're having to turn off things that keep guests satisfied. I'll try and keep events in there that can always lift people out of these loops if they play things correctly, but at the end of the day, sometimes someone's just messed up and they have to fail the scenario. I do also like the idea that for some missions there may be extra factions that are working. They may not appear in all scenarios, but they can be there to, spice up a particular level. I don't know if I'll keep this in. I may just have it so that instead of it being a dedicated faction, there are just some events that happen to only spawn on a particular level in the campaign. The main reason for not keeping this idea in, or not having it as a firm hard "this will be in the game," is I'm worried I might be doing a bit of scope creep here. And this is definitely something that can be on the chopping block if I do decide I'm biting off more than I can chew. I realise I've spent a lot of time explaining what I want to be in the game, and not enough time explaining what's currently implemented. So here we go. Many of the systems are there, but they're only there in a basic capacity. So I'll go through a few of them and explain the current state. The building placement system is in there. There are attachment points, so things have to be aligned correctly. The priority for things being built is based on how far away they are from the central command hub. The central command hub spawns construction drones that are sent out and they go and construct the particular component. If there are 2 components that are the same distance apart on the underlying graph structure, then the one that was placed first will be the priority, simply because that edge will be the first in the list of edges. Currently, the resource system doesn't support the ability to modify how much of a resource is output from a particular component. This is more of a holdover from when I had a slightly simpler model of how I was going to do resources within the game, and as a result, it doesn't support the newer, slightly increased scope. So if I want to be able to implement things like adjacency bonuses and events that affect the output of components, that needs to be changed. Other systems, such as the event system and the faction reputation system, have a lot of, I guess, the data structures there. What it's lacking is, I guess, the ability to sequence everything the way I want. At the moment, anything can just spawn an event so long as it has a table of events to send to the event system. But what I want really is a way of requesting an event to be spawned. After all, I don't want to spam the player with events, and once we get into, I guess, later scenarios, we could have a lot of things requesting that an event happen, and I need a way of sequencing, prioritizing, and limiting the number of events that can spawn in a given time period. All that still needs to be done, and that's definitely something that's going to need to be tweaked by just playing the game and going, well, what didn't I like about the event system this time? There's also a relatively limited amount of content in regards to, well, space station components, the events, the number of factions, and the main reason for that is I'm still at the point where I'm implementing these systems. There isn't much point making a huge amount of content only to have to completely remake it because I've decided to change how everything works. There's also currently no way of gathering resources. You can't go out and mine asteroids or tritium in the atmosphere of a gas giant. So if you want to get a resource at the moment, you have to purchase it from the market. That's not ideal, and I definitely want to have a resource extraction system, and it's one of the next things I'll be working on. There are also currently no systems in place to create or control enemies, and no static defenses either. The reason for this is I was planning on having a system where you'd build spaceships and you could send them on patrols and they would defend against roaming pirates that could come and attack, and so on and so forth, and it just all started to sound a little bit RTS-y. Since my goal is to build more of a management/city builder game and not an RTS, this all smelt of scope creep. Two of the systems I've not really talked about so far are the mission objective system and the component requirement system. Components require a certain amount of crew and power to operate, and this system's in place. I don't love the UI, but the UI will have a full rework for many, many reasons. But on the whole, the system works. I'm happy enough with it, and I have ideas for how I may expand it in the future, but again, I'm not going to mention those now. It could be scope creep. The mission objective system is in a similar place. It works well enough for what I want it to do, and if I want it to do anything more, I'll mention it then, because otherwise I'm probably just promising scope creep. If you feel like I haven't gone in depth into any of these systems and you'd like to know more details, well, I'm planning on making more videos that will go into detail on these different systems. The whole point of this video is to serve as an introduction to the project and give you the general idea of what I want to build. I also haven't mentioned the engine I've been using. It's Unreal Engine 5, and I'm using C++. Well, Blueprints as well. You end up using both when you use C++. The general gist of how that works is C++ for systems, Blueprint for content. In the future, I'd also like to have some videos that go over the code architecture and why I made the decisions I made. It may go over some alternatives to what I did and why I didn't pick them as well. So if any of that, plus the promise of future development logs, sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing. I'll see you next time.